Germany could not build forts or fortifications. If it's something that existed from a long time ago, they obviously could keep it, but no new forts, no new fortifications. And there's no artillery bigger than 10.5 centimeter. And here's one of those big guns. You can see that a guy can almost fit himself right in that tube. And that's the kind of gunpowder, the firepower that they were using in World War I. And no ships bigger than 10,000 tons. What is that? Well, a small destroyer is about 1,000 tons, and an old battleship was 13,000. That meant that Germany could not have battleships again. None of them, okay? No battleships anymore. Treaty of Versailles said no. These things were totally forbidden. No airplanes, no gas. You can see they even put gas masks on the horses. No submarines, and no tanks. They were forbidden. Germany could never have these things. And in the 20s, Germany did not have any of this because they were forbidden. And reparations, everybody wanted them to pay. So that's $55 trillion. $55 trillion in 1918 dollars. I mean, $1 trillion is a lot of money today. $1 trillion back then was like at least twice as much value. And you can see that this came from the New York World newspaper, and it was a political cartoon. And you can see that Germany is here being crushed by the reparations, and it says, "Let's see you collect it." So even the people back then, in the newspapers and politics, knew that the odds of people actually collecting on this kind of reparations was like slim to nil. But the politicians at least forced Germany to sign an agreement saying they would pay this back. So therefore, the people who voted those politicians in said, "Yeah, we got our good deal on this," even though they'll never really collect. Okay, here's a German view of it. You can see Germania is naked. She's obviously, waiting for the wolves to tear her apart. Here's the broken crown and sword of Germany. And the U.S. Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, who Wilson just ignored, he said, "This treaty is bad. This is just a terrible." John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist from Great Britain, said the same thing. Everyone who was trying to advise Clemenceau and Lloyd George and Wilson was saying, "Don't do this, because this is punitive. Nothing like this has ever been done before, and you're just going to cause another war." That's what they were saying then. Anyway, you can say that Lansing said this is immeasurably harsh and humiliating. You're not going to make people go along and change their attitude. In fact, they'll just want revenge, which is exactly what happened. Here is a famous person. At the time, he was only a lieutenant colonel, Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower did not get into the war. He was back in the United States training tank forces, and that's one of the tanks from World War I. He said the Treaty of Versailles had practically guaranteed the outbreak of another great war. He said that in 1919. Everyone could tell this is a bad idea, and you're just going to delay the time it takes to have another war happen. Okay, very famous book. Margaret Macmillan, one of the best writers on the subject, did a book called Paris 1919. In her book, she puts down, later it became commonplace to blame everything that went wrong in the 1920s and 1930s on the peacemakers and the settlements they made in Paris in 1919. And it was. These guys were very short-sighted. We complain today that our politicians are short-sighted, that they only try and fix things right now, or an expression, kick the can down the road, let somebody else deal with the problem. That was absolutely happening in 1919. They just wanted to be reelected, give the people what they thought people wanted, and not worry about the future. Besides, by that point, these guys are dead. What do they care? Here's someone everyone knows. Okay, why did he come into power? Margaret Macmillan, very astutely, points out that Hitler did not wage war because of the Treaty of Versailles. It had nothing to do with it. He found its existence was a godsend for his propaganda. We are humiliated. They've imposed unprecedented punitive damages on Germany. No one's ever done that. We are a modern state, and we deserve to be treated like that by other nations. And instead, we're bankrupt, they're occupying our territory. Why would any German tolerate that? So this did not fall on deaf ears. There were a lot of Germans that said, yeah, why should we? However, and here comes the part that helps us win World War II. When we cut Germany's army way back, we also prevented them from manufacturing military hardware. We prevented them from growing their military force. This is what Germany went to war with. Not armored vehicles. The majority of German forces was horse-drawn. For thousands of years, since the Roman times, horses have been pulled in things. Napoleonic period, 1800s. And Germany is going to fight World War II, at least to start, with horses. Because their industrial capacity was forbidden to do this. And the Nazis only had so many years that they could change that and try and grow suddenly, overnight, a major industrial base. So from 1919 to 1934, when the Nazis came into power, that's all they had. Here's a contrast. This is an American plant that makes tanks. That just came up overnight. We literally built these things in a few months, and we're manufacturing thousands and thousands of vehicles, tanks, airplanes, everything you can imagine. And the reason we did that is because in World War I, we couldn't do that. There was a huge scandal about the War Industrial Board that President Wilson set up. It was corrupt, the guys were incompetent, we couldn't manufacture one of our own tanks. We couldn't manufacture one of our own airplanes in World War I. One of the reasons the Germans were not worried about the United States in World War II is because we messed up so badly in World War I. It's like, you know, the Americans can make good razor blades, but they're not going to make tanks or airplanes, right? So this was a huge difference. And what happened in those years, 1919 and 1940, when we got back in World War II, our military was working with industry so that this could happen quickly. This is the good part of the military-industrial complex, okay? We know that Eisenhower later says, you know, military-industrial complex is a bad thing. A lot of people pointed that out. They say we're too cozy with the people that manufacture the weapons. But the bottom line is, it helped us win World War II because it's all about quantity. And I want to back up and just say that World War I was the first war that was industrial. Before this, yes, there was mass production of muskets, uniforms, all those things that people need, okay, in order to fight a war. But here's the difference. When Napoleon had an army in the field, 500,000 men was staggering. It had been unprecedented. The Romans walked around on with maybe 3 or 4 legions, about 20,000 men. That was an army. He was fighting about the same number of enemies. So you'd have France and a little army like running around like this, fighting each other, okay? Like 2 little amoebas trying to get a hold of each other. That's what would happen previously. When European numbers, population, exploded because of better food, better medicine, and all the other things that had not existed up to that point, all of a sudden you could field armies that had 3 million, 5 million, 10 million men. Well, you need a lot of weapons, and now that you also have massive weapons of mass destruction, their scale, machine guns, giant mortars, all those things, they didn't exist before. There was no guns that big. There was no machine guns like that. The only thing that had existed before that were Gatling guns, which didn't work exactly the same. But you could literally spray an area with bullets, and anybody trying to come through that was going to get hit. He's coming at you over hundreds of yards of territory, he's going to get hit. And if he somehow, luckily, gets through that, you're going to have these giant shells hit, and you don't have to hit the guy like you did in Napoleonic era. Those were solid balls of lead. If you didn't hit him, it went by him, it's like, whoo! Not in World War I. The concussive power of those explosions had a radius where they would literally kill people by crushing their insides, okay? You didn't have to blow his arms off or anything else. There were many cases where people were just lying on the ground, it looked like they were asleep. They were dead because of the concussion from this, which is also where PTSD and these other things are coming from, they realize, is that a bomb doesn't have to hit you. All it has to do is throw the explosive force, like in football, okay? It isn't that you get a concussion because someone's hitting your head. It's because your brain is bouncing around inside your skull. The force is so great that it pushes your brain into your skull. And that's how concussions happen. And if it's hard enough, you basically have the insides of you killed as a result. So, here's another great one. Look at this. You can't even see the end of the factory. These are heavy B-24 bombers, 4-engine bombers that would go over and bomb Germany and Europe. These are the ones that made the raid on Ploiești, which is the giant oil fields in Romania. But this is what's so cool about America's ability to produce, because it's going to take quantity, massive industrial quantity, to win the war. But this is the best testimony ever said about America. This is by Joseph Stalin, the dictator of Soviet Union, Russia. And he said at the Tehran Conference in December 1943, "I want to tell you from the Russian point of view what the President and the United States have done to win the war. They know in 43 they're going to win. They know it. The most important things in this war are machines. The United States has proven that it can turn out from 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Per month. Russia can only turn out at most 3,000 airplanes a month. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the use of those machines, through Lend-Lease, which is how we gave the Russians the weapons and things they needed to win, we would lose this war." That's a pretty amazing statement from Joseph Stalin, from a secretive police state that Russia was at the time. And as Joseph also said, there was a certain quality in quantity. Okay? So if we just have to crush the Germans in numbers, even if we lose, as they did, 100 million Russians, and that figure is just an estimate by the Russians, they lost 100 million people in World War II, and that's just one country. It was on a scale unprecedented. Even World War I looks tiny in comparison. Now, in World War II, if you look at books, you look at people who play games and everything else, Germany's World War II tanks look like the Tiger tank, very famous, the Panther tank, notice how big they are. I mean, these were powerful tanks, great tanks. But that's what they started with, was these little tankettes. See that guy? So the difference in size, and there's a medium tank, a short-barreled gun. Germany didn't start the war with big, giant tanks because they couldn't make them. They didn't have them. It took them halfway through the war before they were able to manufacture those big tanks because they weren't allowed to have manufacturing before the war. So they had to rush to try and make up for that shortage, that lack during the war. Here's a chart. I don't know if you can see it too well, but this just shows you when you look at how many numbers of things are made, these are the tanks. And Germany made, during the war, these are medium tanks and higher, 32,000 tanks. That's pretty impressive. 32,000 tanks from zero and no industrial power and no factories. They were able to manufacture 32,000 during the war. The Allies, United Kingdom, United States, and the USSR, manufactured 238,000 tanks. 10 times almost what Germany did. This is a huge difference. And that's just one category. That's just tanks. What about the air forces? Well, Germany started with a really good airplane, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, very modern. Ironically, the first prototype had to use a Rolls-Royce British engine because Germany had none. They had none because they weren't allowed to make them. So their first modern plane used British airplane engines in order to test itself. But you can see how this old-fashioned plane, that got used through the entire war because Germany just didn't have the capacity to make, like that factory you saw, B-24 bombers or all these other things. They just couldn't do it. So they had to cut corners. So they had a modern fighter and really old transport and bombers. And here are the Luftwaffe. Again, the numbers I saw, I'm sorry it's not bigger, but basically, Germany had about 120,000 aircraft, 120,000, but they never had more than about 4,500, about 4,000 at any one time, and that's all different types, bombers, fighters, reconnaissance, everything. The Allies had 593 airplanes they manufactured during the war. And when President Franklin Roosevelt was sitting there with his planners trying to figure out what do we have to do to win this war, he said, well, we have to manufacture a lot of planes, a lot of everything. Tanks, aircraft carriers, battleships, we've got to have them. And he said, we're going to manufacture 100,000 airplanes. And all those generals were like, ooh, the president's drinking some kind of Kool-Aid here. We're not, there's no way. It's like, those numbers are more than all of the planes of all of the air forces in World War I. And the president said, we're going to do this. And they're all like, we don't think so, but we'll follow orders. Well, we didn't. Instead, we made 303,000 airplanes in World War II.